Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all. I want to start, we're studying in John, but I want to start in Luke, just for a comparison. At the very beginning of Luke's gospel, he says this: "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that have been taught." Very plain, very straightforward. Luke was an excellent historian. He was an excellent writer. He checked out his facts. He did his research. He checked with the eyewitnesses, and he wrote his gospel. It's not that different from what we've talked about in John's statement of his purpose when he wrote his gospel. When he said, not at the beginning, but close to the end, that these things are written so that you may believe in the name of Jesus as the Messiah, and in believing have life in his name. Similar purposes, basically the same. And yet the two gospels are quite different. From this, I conclude that God did not simply dictate the Gospels or any other Bible book to the authors, the writers, the human part of what produced the Bible. There was a human initiative that was involved. There's often different language, different vocabularies that are used by the different writers that kind of reflect the different personalities and the different backgrounds, experiences, and knowledge of the writers. For example, when Paul writes in Acts about a shipwreck, he uses a term that when the soldiers wrapped ropes around the ship to keep it from breaking up. It was the same word that was used to describe a bandage on a wound. Luke was a physician. It kind of reflects Luke's nature and his personality. John's gospel is quite different from Luke's. If you read one and then the next, you notice that difference. John's gospel, to me, seems to be a little more focused on the discourses of Jesus. There are several that are written and recorded for us in the Gospel of John that we do not have in any other gospel. There is some information that is the same, that Luke included, that Mark and Matthew did too, and John does. But for the most part, we've got four independent witnesses. Especially John is independent of the other writers. And that's a blessing. That's wonderful. We've got all this information about Jesus. And it helps us who are dependent upon the written word to a large extent to understand God and to know Jesus, to have more information on which to base our faith. And I think as we go through studying the Gospel of John, we might have the experience of being corrected in some of our impressions of Jesus, some of the conceptions that we have about him. One of my favorite books that I've ever read by a Christian writer who is also a favorite, Philip Yancey, he wrote a book called The Jesus I Never Knew. And he shares his own experience of studying the Gospels and how it changed some of the early perceptions he had from his childhood of going to church, going to Sunday school. Not that that's not a good experience, but that when we're young, we're only capable of understanding so much, aren't we? But when we grow up and mature, especially as we mature in the faith as we should, then we can have a deeper understanding of Jesus. We can see him more clearly. And I'm telling you, that's the only thing that's going to tie us to God and to eternal life. It's only through Jesus that we have that blessing. And so I hope you're reading John. And the passage that was read for us this morning by Barron from John chapter 7 is one more that I want us to think about for just the next few minutes, because I think it can teach us something very important about Jesus. In John chapter 6 and 7, we've got some long discourses of Jesus. He's, for the most part, discoursing with the Jews. And these are two separate occasions that are centered on the times of the Jewish feast days. In chapter 6, it was the Passover, which is in the spring. The Passover. is when the sacrificial lamb is offered, right? So Jesus was crucified the day before Passover, the day before the Sabbath, which was the Passover festival. And it was on a Friday. So he was buried on that evening and then was in the grave over the Passover and then was raised from the dead on the first day of the week following. So that's what we have in chapter 6. And we hear Jesus talking a lot about that after feeding the 5,000, which, by the way, is one of those things which is in all 4 Gospels. When we began studying over a year ago, there was a little pamphlet that we had that was called The Harmony of the Gospels, something like that. And it has a lot of good information. And a lot of you got those. And I might refer you back to that in this series of lessons on the Gospel of John, because there's some really helpful information about how the Gospels are interrelated and the purposes and the audiences that each writer seemed to be addressing when they wrote their Gospels. And then that brings us to chapter 7. Chapter 7 mentions the Festival of Tabernacles. The Festival of Tabernacles was instituted to remind the Israelites, as all the feast days were, of what God had done for them in the past. And we remember the Exodus from Egypt, the 40 years of wandering in the desert when the Israelites lived in tents, tabernacles. That's what a tabernacle is. It's a tent. And so they had a feast when they would spend a week living in a tent to remind them what their ancestors had endured and how, especially this part, how God had blessed them and fed them manna in the wilderness after they grumbled. That part wasn't good, but God responded to their need and provided for them whatever they needed. Water, manna, quail. You remember the story of the wandering in the wilderness. That's what the background is for chapter 7. The part especially that Baron read. So Jesus and his brothers conversing. Some of you have siblings. A lot of us do. Not everyone does. But it's a blessing to have siblings, I guess. I think it is. I had an older brother. I know some of you guys know what I'm talking about right down here. You've got an older brother. You've got older brothers. It's kind of a mixed bag, I think, having an older brother. Would you agree, Victor? See, I didn't mention your name. I know it was for me. There were times when my brother was a hero to me. And there were times when I wanted to put out a contract on his life. If I could have found a hitman that would work for bubble gum and baseball cards, he might have been in trouble. But he was a mechanic, and I was never a mechanic, and I'm still not. And I was always so amazed. And when I had trouble with my car, he's the one I called. And he always asked me the first question, have you worked on it? And if I had, that made the situation worse. So I learned in time to just start and call him first. That was the first step I made. And so I was amazed at his knowledge in that particular area and in other areas. He was quite a bookworm. He loved history. And there were a lot of things about him that impressed me. But as I said, sometimes it was difficult. Jesus had difficulty with his siblings. He was the older brother, of course. And these, of course, were half-brothers. They had the same mother, but not the same father. But still, they were siblings. And we know what that means. When two people live together, or more, 2 or more, in a close proximity in a family, there's bound to be friction, isn't there? The closer we are, the more the friction. Jesus' disciples didn't give him, I don't think, the kinds of problems that his own family did. Now, the lesson the title that I chose for this lesson today is that Jesus avoided people. And I wonder what you feel about that title. Jesus avoided people? That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like the Jesus I know. Jesus loved people. He loved everybody. And he still does. In fact, he even loved his enemies. He prayed for the people who put him on the cross to be forgiven, which is pretty mind-boggling. But there were also times, and this is one of them, when Jesus avoided people. Jesus would sometimes slip away just to be by himself. He needed to have a talk with his Father, perhaps. And often the the pattern of his life, the cycle of his life was to spend time on the mountain in prayer. And then he had the spiritual resources to go to the marketplace and be with people. But there were times when he avoided people. Now, I wanted to make that point today. It's more than just a curiosity because it's something we can relate to too. Human needs are cyclical. We have a need to be with people. We have a need to have friends. We have a need to have relationships. And that's why God put us in a spiritual family. That need is to be fulfilled, at least partially, by our friends in the church. Now, you need friends on the outside too. We need sinner friends. We need to be able to be an influence to people on the outside. And how can we do that if we don't know them and don't have relationships with them? And that's one of the things I love about living in a small town. You can kind of get to know a lot of people. And you walk around and somebody at the grocery store, I saw Mr. Barber over there. Tommy was there yesterday. And that's neat. I love going there and somebody say, hey, how you doing? And somebody says your name. That's a good thing. But human needs are cyclical. That means they can be fulfilled, and then the pleasure principle is not present. A great example that I talked with about the teenagers in class this morning is food. You don't even have to do a whole lot, but as time passes, you get hungry, don't you? In fact, you may be right now. You may have a need for food. So we begin to experience that. It's not something we decide. It just happens within our body. It's the way God made us. And that need arises and we suddenly become conscious of it. Hey, I want to eat something. So let's think about a time of eating. A feast day maybe. Maybe more, not so much the feast of Passover, but Tabernacles, which is more this time of year. The Feast of Tabernacles was also a time to celebrate the harvest. And we're going to do that too with a tradition we have that we like to call Thanksgiving. After the harvest time has pretty much passed by, we can thank God for that and enjoy some of the wonderful food that we have to enjoy. And you've been there and you've done that. And if you're a good American, you've done that. It's American tradition to eat too much on Thanksgiving, isn't it? And so you go and you eat too much and you're full, and all of a sudden the food doesn't look so inviting anymore. But Aunt Sally comes and she made her lemon chiffon pie, and so you've got to try this. Oh, no thanks. Really, I can't eat another bite. You've been there. We've all had that experience. That's the cyclical nature of human needs. Jesus had those human needs. It's an expression of his humanity that he sometimes avoided people. Now, sometimes he avoided people, not just to be alone with his Father or to be alone with himself, but because they're trying to kill him. And it wasn't his time yet. That's what we have in John chapter 7. It's stated very plainly. The Jews wanted to take his life. And so Jesus did not go up to the Feast of Tabernacles right away. His brothers gave him a hard time about it. That's the way I read it. Do you see it that way? They're kind of saying, hey, you want to be a preacher, a prophet, you want to attract a lot of attention, why don't you go up to the feast? Everybody who wants to be known publicly has to be where all the people are. Of course, they're in Galilee having this conversation. So Jesus says, the time is not right. My title, you may disagree with it, but at least it might raise some questions. Why would Jesus want to avoid people? We've suggested a couple of reasons already, but I think the real answer to that question, the real clue, is right here in the text. When Jesus says in verse 6, the time right for me has not yet come. For you, any time is right. But for me, the time is not right. Have you noticed, if you've been reading John, you probably have, that this is a kind of a theme in John. Remember at Cana, where Jesus went to the wedding party, they ran out of wine and his mother said, you got to do something. And John records there a kind of an interesting response to his mother. Now I know Jesus had no sin. He was never disrespectful to his parents, because after all, that is one of the 10 Commandments, right, Noah? Yeah, it is. We obey our parents. So he did, but he said, woman, what do I have to do with you? My time has not yet come. What did he mean? It wasn't time for him to do a miracle, but he went ahead and did it because she wanted him to. But it attracts a lot of attention. It was difficult for Jesus to have time alone. After his ministry began and he was healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, making the lame people walk, creating a great meal big enough to feed 5,000 men, not to mention the women and children, which is in chapter 6 here in John. And there was also a feeding of 4,000 people. That attracts a lot of attention. And it did in John chapter 6, where the crowds followed him. Even after he crossed the lake in the middle of the night, walking across most of the way, got in the boat with the disciples, calmed the storm, and then they were across. And the crowd followed him finally when they couldn't find him the next day. And Jesus said, I tell you the truth, you're not coming to find me because you want to hear the teaching of God or because you believe I came from God, but because you want to eat the bread and the fish. And then he went on to talk about the bread they should be seeking, the living bread, which he was the living bread. So in chapter 7, we've got similar things going on, but not in Galilee anymore. Now, Jesus finally does go to the feast. But why had he waited? Why did he choose on this occasion and others to avoid people? It's because his time had not yet come. John 2, the wedding in Cana, here in chapter 7. Over in chapter 8, once again, let's see, verse 20, which it's been an hour or two since I read it, so I forgot what it said. So John 8:20 says, he spoke these words while teaching in the temple area near the place where the offerings were put. So he's in Jerusalem. Yet no one seized him. We've already found out in chapter 7 where Baron read that the Jews want to kill him and they're plotting to arrest him, but no one seized him. And the only explanation John gives is his time had not yet come. How did Jesus escape their attempts to arrest him? Later in chapter 7, the Pharisees and chief priests even send out the temple police to bring him in. He's out there teaching right in public. He's in the open. Go get him and bring him in. So the guards go and come back empty-handed. And the chief priests and Pharisees say, where is he? Why didn't you bring him in? And they said, we've never seen anybody like this. We've never heard anyone like this. No man ever spoke like this man. And he had the multitudes of people in the palm of his hand with his teaching. And I suppose if they had arrested him on the spot, they might have got stoned by the crowd. It seems to be the way those people were. They were kind of violent, kind of crazy that way. Even Nicodemus, later in chapter 7, suggests that we don't condemn a man until we've heard him give his defense. But the minds of the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, and the Pharisees were made up. They didn't want to hear any facts or any practices about hearing a defense. And so Nicodemus, who was a disciple, who was a believer in Jesus, who tried to interject his opinion here, was put down in a very harsh way. What, are you a Galilean? It's interesting. You know, the Jews had their logical and legal reasons for rejecting Jesus. Even biblical reasons. The Bible had said where Jesus would be born, where the Messiah would come from. But we don't even know where he came from. He's a Galilean. The Messiah doesn't come from Galilee. Case closed. Well, we know Jesus wasn't born in Galilee. He was born at Bethlehem, little town of Bethlehem, right? So he was born in the right place. He did fulfill the prophecies. They didn't do their homework. But they thought they had their airtight case ready to close, that Jesus could not be the Messiah. And I wonder, how many times I've been like that. I had my reasons. I knew why this or that couldn't be, but I was wrong. For those whose minds and hearts were open, and they're represented in chapter 7 as well, they said, yes, but no one could do the things that this man does unless God was with him. And so Jesus, in time, went to the feast, openly taught, attracted a lot of attention, but the sacrificial lamb is not killed in the fall at the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. The sacrificial lamb is killed at the Passover in the spring. So John will be recording, and we will be studying later about Jesus' third trip to Jerusalem that John talks about for the Passover time. That was the time for the triumphal entry. That was the time to attract a lot of attention. That was the time when Jesus would say, before he was arrested, to his disciples in chapter 13, verse 1, that his time had come. Or rather, it's John that records it, that Jesus knew his time had come. And that's in the text also in chapter 12. So what does that mean? Jesus' timing was important. The Jews are not going to arrest Jesus. They're not going to kill him until he is ready for them to arrest him and kill him. In the meantime, he has to fulfill the law. He has to fulfill the prophets. Jesus hesitated and avoided people for the sake of his disciples, so that he could have time with them, so that he could prepare them for what was going to happen. The time was short as it was, and they didn't even understand until much later on what was happening. Jesus avoided people for the sake of his brothers, because his brothers at this time, obviously, as John records, did not believe in him. From the Synoptic Gospels, we learned that Jesus' family thought he had kind of gone off his rocker. They said, we need to save him from himself. He's got some kind of Messiah complex or something. And so they went to get him. Remember that story? And so people came to Jesus, who was inside a home with a multitude of people around, as was almost always the case. And they said, your family's wanting to see you outside. And Jesus said, my family are those who do the will of God. He knew why they were there, and he knew that they were there. But in time, that changed. Jesus' brother James became an elder in the church of Jerusalem and was a pillar of the church and wrote a wonderful book, the book named after him, the book of James, written by Jesus' half-brother, James, who was martyred early on. James was a faithful servant of God and elder in the church of Jerusalem. He came to believe in Jesus, in who Jesus claimed to be. He believed it, and he was a faithful servant. And all of that leads us to the conclusion that Jesus avoided people for this purpose, so that he could provide salvation and time for his brothers, for the disciples, and for us. He was very conscious of the fact that one day people would be here in Spearman, Texas, putting their faith in him and would need to know what he had done to provide for them. The Gospel of John shows that there is a great divide taking place. People are saying this and that about Jesus. Well, he's a liar. He's deceiving the people. Other people said, no, he's a good man. He does miracles. He heals the sick. And he's from God, or he couldn't do that. The same thing is happening today. A great divide in response to Jesus, who he is and who he claims to be. And at the end of time, in the parable that Jesus himself told, there's going to be another great divide. When all who are in their graves come forth before the great throne of judgment, and Jesus, as the good shepherd, divides the goats from the sheep. But the good news of that terrifying scene of judgment, that kind of makes me nervous, is that you can decide right now to be a sheep or a goat. You can decide right now which side of that great divide you're going to be on. Let's stand and sing our song.